There are moments in life when you realize that the people you love weren't trying to hurt you. They were simply carrying burdens you never saw. I learned that lesson on a rainy Saturday afternoon, 20 years too late. It all began after my mother passed away. The funeral was quiet, just close family, a few neighbors, old friends who still remembered her homemade apple pie and the way she greeted everyone with the same warm smile. When the last guest left, my father and I stood alone in the driveway. Neither of us knew what to say. Grief has a strange way of stealing words. "I'll clean the attic tomorrow," Dad finally whispered. "It has to be done." I nodded. That attic had been untouched for decades. As a child, I wasn't allowed to go up there alone. Mom always laughed and said, "It's full of things that belonged to yesterday." Back then, I thought she meant old furniture. The next morning, rain tapped softly against the roof as we climbed the narrow wooden stairs. Dust floated through the beams of light, shining from a tiny window. Old photo albums, broken lamps, boxes labeled Christmas, Grandpa's fishing gear. Everything smelled like old wood and memories. Dad quietly sorted through one corner while I carried boxes toward the stairs. Neither of us spoke much. Every object seemed to remind us of Mom. A teacup, a knitted blanket, an old recipe book covered in flour stains. It felt as if she had just stepped out of the room. Then I noticed a small blue box tucked behind an antique rocking chair. It wasn't covered in dust like everything else. Someone had placed it there carefully, almost deliberately. I picked it up. There was no lock, only a faded label written in my mother's handwriting. "For Ethan." My heart skipped. Dad looked over. I've never seen that before. Neither had I. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Inside were 7 envelopes. Each one had a date. 1998, 1999, Lion Sen, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004. Every envelope was addressed to the same person. Dad. I frowned. "What is this?" Dad walked closer. His face slowly lost color. He reached for the first envelope but stopped before touching it. I don't remember these." I carefully opened the oldest one. The paper inside was covered with large, uneven handwriting. The handwriting of an 8-year-old boy. My handwriting. I stared at the first sentence. "Dear Dad, today was Father's Day at school." Everyone else's dad came. I kept looking at the door because I thought maybe you'd surprise me, but you never came. I stopped reading. My chest tightened. I remembered writing that letter. I remembered crying afterward. I had believed Dad simply didn't care. Slowly, I looked up. He was staring at the page, with tears already filling his eyes. His voice barely escaped his lips. "Ethan, I've never seen this before." I opened the second envelope. Another letter. Another memory I had forgotten. Another piece of a childhood I thought I understood. Outside, the rain continued falling. Inside, 20 years of silence had finally begun to speak. And neither of us was prepared for what those 7 forgotten letters would reveal. Neither of us spoke. The attic suddenly felt much smaller. Dad sat down slowly on the old rocking chair. The same chair where Mom used to read bedtime stories to me. Only this time, he looked like a man afraid of what he was about to hear. He nodded toward the letter still in my hands. "Please, read it." I took a deep breath and continued. "Dear Dad, today was Father's Day at school. Mrs. Carter told everyone to invite their fathers. Tom's dad came. Emily's dad came. Even Jack's dad drove 4 hours to be there." I kept looking at the classroom door. Every time it opened, I thought it was you, but it wasn't. Maybe you were busy. Mom says you work very hard so we can have a better life. I know that's important, but I wish today you were just my dad, not someone else's employee. I drew a picture of us fishing together. I know we never went fishing, but maybe one day we will. Love, Ethan. Ud. I couldn't continue. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I remembered writing every sentence. I remembered folding the letter. I remembered placing it in an envelope. And I remembered leaving it on the kitchen table. Because Mom had promised, "I'll make sure Dad gets it." I looked at my father. His face was wet with tears. He covered his mouth with one trembling hand. "I swear to you, I never knew I would have been there." His voice cracked completely. "Ethan, I would have walked if I had to." For the first time in my life, I believed him. because the pain in his eyes couldn't be faked. He wasn't remembering. He was mourning a moment he had been robbed of. Dad reached for the envelope again. This time, he opened it carefully. Inside was something I hadn't noticed. A small crayon drawing folded behind the letter. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, holding fishing rods beside a lake. Above them, in crooked blue letters, were the words, "Best day ever." Dad stared at the drawing for nearly a minute. 2. Then he laughed through his tears. "You even gave me a baseball cap." I smiled weakly. "You always wore one to work." He nodded. "I still have it." Silence returned. The kind of silence only family can share. After a while, I picked up the second envelope. The date read, September 14, 1919. I opened it. The handwriting looked slightly neater. I had turned 9. "Dear Dad, today I scored my first goal in soccer. Coach said I played really well. After the game, I looked in the parking lot. I thought maybe this time you'd be there." Mom clapped really loudly. She even bought me ice cream. "But I wanted to hear you say, I'm proud of you. Maybe next time. Love, Ethan." Dad lowered his head. I was there. I looked at him in confusion. "What?" "I was there. I got off work early. I drove all the way to the field." He looked toward the rain-covered window. But when I arrived, the game was already over. "What?" He nodded slowly. "My boss wouldn't let me leave. I argued with him. I even told him my son needed me. He said if I walked out, I'd lose my job." He smiled sadly. I walked out anyway. My heart tightened, but I was 20 minutes too late. He reached into his wallet. Carefully, he unfolded an old, faded receipt. On the back was a date. September 14, 1919. "I bought you a new soccer ball on the way home. I wanted to surprise you." I remembered that ball, bright blue, my favorite one. I had no idea why he bought it. I thought it was just another gift. Now, I finally understood. It wasn't a gift. It was an apology, one he never had the chance to explain. Outside, the rain began to fall harder. Inside the attic, 2 decades of misunderstandings were quietly falling apart. There were still 5 unopened letters waiting inside the blue box. And somehow, I knew the hardest truths were still ahead. For a long time, neither of us reached for the next envelope. The first 2 letters had already rewritten memories we had carried for more than 20 years. I had spent most of my life believing my father chose work over me. He had spent those same years believing I understood why he wasn't always there. We were both wrong. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with questions. Questions neither of us knew how to ask. Finally, I picked up the 3rd envelope. The date read, the 8th of June, 2000. I was 10 years old. The paper inside was wrinkled, as if I had folded and unfolded it many times before sealing it. I smiled sadly. Even as a child, I must have struggled to find the right words. I began reading. Dear Dad, today was career day at school. Everyone's parents talked about their jobs. Tom's dad is a police officer. Emily's mom is a nurse. When Mrs. Carter asked what my dad did, I told everyone you build bridges. I don't really know if that's true. I just know you leave before the sun comes up. And sometimes you come home after I'm already asleep. I wanted to tell everyone that you're a hero, because Mom says you're working so our family can have a better future. I hope that's true. Sometimes, I would trade that future, just to eat dinner with you tonight. Love, Ethan. When I finished reading, the attic was completely silent. Dad lowered his head. His shoulders trembled. I wasn't building bridges, he whispered. I looked at him. What were you doing? He let out a long, exhausted sigh. I was cleaning them. I frowned. What? I worked the night shift cleaning construction equipment. 12 hours, every day. 6, sometimes 7 days a week. I had never known. As a child, I imagined my father working in an office, or driving a truck. I never once imagined him spending nights covered in grease, mud, and concrete dust. I lied because I was embarrassed, he admitted. When kids asked what their parents did, I didn't want you to feel ashamed. I stared at him. Ashamed? He nodded slowly. I never finished college. I couldn't give you expensive vacations. I couldn't buy you the newest toys. The only thing I knew how to do was work. His voice cracked. So I worked. Harder than I ever should have. I felt a lump form in my throat. Growing up, I never cared what his job was. I only cared that he wasn't home. How many years had we both carried burdens the other never knew existed? I looked back into the box. 4 envelopes remained. One of them had a drawing sticking out from the top. Curious, I opened it. A folded piece of notebook paper slipped onto the floor. It was a family portrait. Mom, Dad, me, and our little house. Above it, written in bright red crayon, were 5 simple words. My family is my home. Dad picked it up carefully. His hands shook. I kept this on my locker at work. I looked at him in surprise. What? He turned the paper over. A small piece of old tape still clung to the back. It must have fallen off one day. I wondered where it went. For the first time that afternoon, we both laughed. Just a little. It wasn't because anything was funny. It was because, after hours of crying, our hearts needed a moment to breathe. Then I noticed something else inside the envelope. A tiny gold star. The kind teachers placed on homework. Underneath it was a handwritten note. Not mine. My mother's. It read, "He waited until you fell asleep before kissing your forehead tonight." He whispered, "Tell him I'm proud of him. Even if I forget to say it tomorrow." My hands froze. I read it again, then again. Slowly, I looked at Dad. His eyes widened. I never knew she wrote that. Neither did I. Mom had quietly hidden little pieces of our lives inside these envelopes, not to keep us apart, but perhaps hoping that one day, when we needed them most, they would bring us back together. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Sunlight broke through the small attic window. A single beam of light landed across the blue box. 3 letters remained unopened, and somehow, I had the feeling my mother had left her most important message for last. The attic had grown quiet again. The rain was gone. Only the gentle ticking of an old wall clock echoed through the room. It reminded me of all the years that had passed. Years that suddenly felt so different. I looked inside the blue box. 3 envelopes remained. The 4th one was thicker than the others. The date read, November 2, 2001. I was 11 years old enough to notice things, old enough to misunderstand them. I carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting had changed. The childish curves were gone. The words looked more serious, more careful, as though I had spent hours deciding what to write. I began reading. Dear Dad, I don't think you're going to read this one either. Maybe Mom forgets to give them to you, or maybe you're too busy. I don't know anymore. Today, something happened at school. A boy said, "You don't love me." He said if you did, you'd come to my games. You'd help me with my homework. You'd know my teacher's name. I told him he was wrong. I even got into a fight because of it. But when I came home, I started wondering if maybe he was right. I don't want presents anymore. I don't want toys. I just want one whole day with you. Love, Ethan. I couldn't continue. Every word felt heavier than the last. I slowly lowered the paper. Dad hadn't moved. His eyes were fixed on the floor. His hands were tightly clasped together. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, "I remember that fight." I looked at him. "You do?" He nodded. The school called me. I was working on a construction site almost 3 hours away. I begged my supervisor to let me leave. His voice cracked. He laughed. He told me, "Your son will get over it." Dad looked away. "So, I quit." The words caught me completely off guard. "You quit your job?" He nodded. That afternoon, I packed my tools, walked off the site, and never went back. I stared at him in disbelief. But we struggled financially after that. A faint smile appeared on his face. Yes, we almost lost the house. I searched my memory. I remembered that time. Mom had started working evenings. We stopped eating at restaurants. Christmas gifts became smaller. I had always assumed money was simply tight. I never knew why. You never told me. Dad shrugged gently. What would have been the point? I didn't want you carrying adult problems. He reached into another dusty box beside the rocking chair. After a few moments, he pulled out an old baseball glove, brown leather, worn around the edges. I recognized it instantly. My first glove. He smiled. "Do you remember when I gave it to you?" I nodded. My 12th birthday. Dad turned the glove over. Inside, written in faded black marker, were the words, "Paid with my first paycheck." I looked at him, confused. My first paycheck? From the new job. He smiled softly. It paid half as much. But I was finally home every evening. Suddenly, memories rushed back. Dad helping me with math homework, teaching me how to throw a baseball, eating dinner together almost every night. I'd always thought things had simply changed on their own. Now I knew why. He had sacrificed his career to become the father I needed. A tear rolled down my cheek. "I'm sorry." Dad looked surprised. "For what?" "For believing you chose work over me." He gently shook his head. "And I'm sorry for making you feel like you had to wonder." Neither apology could change the past, but somehow they made the future feel lighter. I reached for the 5th envelope. Before opening it, something slipped from between the pages. A small photograph. It showed Dad and me sitting on the front porch. He was teaching me how to tie a fishing knot. I couldn't have been older than 12. On the back of the photograph, in Mom's handwriting, were the words, "He finally kept the promise he made to himself." And Ethan finally got the father he'd been waiting for. Dad quietly wiped another tear from his face. "I wish your mother could see us now." I smiled through my own tears. "I think she can." Sunlight filled the attic. For the first time that day, the room no longer felt like a place filled with old memories. It felt like a place where a family was slowly finding one another again. Only 2 letters remained, and although I didn't know it yet, the next one would reveal a sacrifice my mother had carried alone for more than 20 years. The blue box felt lighter now. Only 2 envelopes remained. Yet somehow, they seemed heavier than all the others. Dad reached for one but stopped halfway. "You should open it." His voice was calm, but I could hear the fear hiding beneath it. The date on the envelope read, Augusto Sprezece, 2003. I had just turned 13. The age when children stop saying everything out loud and begin hiding what hurts. I carefully unfolded the letter. The paper was covered in corrections. Words crossed out. Sentences rewritten. It looked as though I'd struggled to write it. I began reading. "Dear Dad, I know you work closer to home now. I know you come to almost every baseball game. I know you help me with homework. I know you try. I really do. But sometimes, I still feel angry. Not because of today, because of all the days we already lost. I wish we could go back. I wish we could start over. I wish I didn't remember sitting alone at school waiting for you. Sometimes I feel bad for thinking about those memories, because now you're always here. Maybe I'm the one who doesn't know how to let go. Love, Ethan." I lowered the letter. The room was completely silent. Dad stared through the attic window, his eyes fixed on something far away. "I remember that year," he whispered. "You started pulling away from me." I nodded. I didn't know why. I did. He looked at me. "You were protecting yourself." His words struck me immediately. He was right. I hadn't been angry anymore. I'd simply stopped expecting too much. Because if I expected less, it hurt less. Dad sighed deeply. I noticed, but I thought, if I kept showing up, one day you'd trust me again. I smiled sadly. "You did. It just took me a while." He nodded. I was willing to wait. Those 5 words settled quietly between us. I was willing to wait. That's what love often looks like. Not grand speeches, not dramatic gestures, just quietly staying, long enough for someone to believe you. I reached into the envelope again. Something else was inside. A folded piece of stationery. Different paper, different handwriting. It belonged to Mom. At the top she had written, "For Ethan, if he ever reads this." My heart skipped. I unfolded it carefully. "My sweet boy, if you're reading this, then you finally found the letters. There's something I've carried for many years. A secret I never wanted either of you to blame yourselves for. You often thought I forgot to give your letters to Dad. The truth is, I didn't forget. I kept them. Every single one." I stopped breathing. Dad looked at me in confusion. "What?" I handed him the letter. As he read, the color slowly drained from his face. I continued reading it aloud. "The first time Ethan gave me a letter, your father had just started working 14-hour shifts. He came home exhausted. He barely slept. He blamed himself for missing so much of your childhood. One night, After reading a bill we couldn't afford to pay, he sat alone in the garage and cried. It was the only time I ever saw him completely lose hope. The next morning, Ethan handed me his first Father's Day letter. I read it before giving it to your dad, and I couldn't do it, because I knew those words would break what little strength he had left. So I placed the letter inside this blue box. Then another came, and another. Each one became harder to give him. I kept telling myself, I'll wait until life gets easier. But life never slowed down. The years passed, the box filled, and eventually, I became too ashamed to admit what I'd done. So I hid it in the attic. Not because I wanted to keep you apart, but because I loved you both too much to watch either of you suffer. If there's one thing I ask of you, please don't be angry with me. I wasn't trying to protect the truth. I was trying to protect the two people I loved most. Love always. Mom. By the time I reached the end, neither Dad nor I could hold back our tears. Everything made sense now. The missing letters, the misunderstandings, the years of quiet distance. Mom hadn't chosen one of us over the other. She had made an impossible decision, trying to protect us both. Dad carefully folded the letter. I wish she had trusted me. His voice trembled. I wish she had trusted that I could survive the pain. I placed a hand on his shoulder, and she probably wished that too. We sat there for a long time. No blame, no anger, only understanding. Sometimes, the people we love make mistakes, not because they love us too little, but because they love us so much. They're terrified of causing us pain. I looked back into the blue box. Only one envelope remained. It was different from all the others. Instead of being addressed to Dad, it simply read, "To both of you." For reasons I couldn't explain, my heart began to race. Somehow, I knew my mother had saved her final words. For the moment when our family was finally whole again, neither of us reached for the final envelope. It rested quietly at the bottom of the blue box, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. Dad looked at it for several seconds. His voice was barely a whisper. Your mother always believed that every family deserves one last chance. I carefully picked it up. Unlike the others, it wasn't sealed. Perhaps Mom wanted to make sure we'd never struggle to open it. Across the front, written in her elegant handwriting, were 5 simple words. To my 2 favorite men. I smiled through my tears. She had called us that for years. When I was little, I never understood why. Now, it sounded like the greatest title in the world. Inside was a single folded letter. The paper was surprisingly neat, as though she had rewritten it many times before deciding these were the right words. I unfolded it carefully. Then I began to read. My dearest Ethan and David, if you're reading this together, then something wonderful has happened. It means you're sitting beside each other, talking, listening, doing something that life didn't always allow you to do. Before either of you blame yourselves, I need you to know something. Neither of you failed. Not as a father, not as a son. Life simply asked too much from both of you at the same time. David, you carried the weight of providing for our family. You believed every extra hour at work meant a safer future. Ethan, you carried the weight of waiting. You believed every empty seat meant you weren't important. You were both wrong, because love was always there. It just kept arriving in different forms. Sometimes it looked like a packed lunch your father made before sunrise. Sometimes it looked like the warm dinners your son waited to eat until you came home. Neither of you noticed the love the other was quietly giving away every day. I paused. Dad covered his face with both hands. Soft sobs echoed through the attic. I continued. There is something neither of you knows. Every night, after Ethan fell asleep, David would walk into his room. He would pull the blanket over your shoulders, kiss your forehead, and whisper, "I'm sorry I wasn't there today. I'll try again tomorrow." He never missed a single night. Not one. I looked up at Dad. His eyes widened. "You knew?" He slowly shook his head. I thought she was asleep. A small laugh escaped through his tears. She always pretended. I smiled. That sounded exactly like Mom, always watching over us, even when we didn't realize it. I continued reading. Ethan, do you remember the blue bicycle you received for your 12th birthday? Your father sold the only watch his own father left him to buy that bicycle. He told me, I can live without a watch, but I can't live with seeing my son left behind while all his friends are riding together. He never told you, because he didn't want gratitude. He only wanted your smile. I stared at Dad. The watch Grandpa gave you? He nodded quietly. I sold it the day before your birthday. I remembered that bicycle. I had ridden it every day for years. At the time, I thought it was just another birthday gift. Now I realized it had cost him far more than money. Mom's letter continued. David, do you remember the school play in 7th grade? You thought you missed it because traffic stopped you. You were wrong. You arrived before the curtain opened. You stood in the very back of the auditorium. You stayed until the final applause. Ethan never saw you, but I did. You cried through the entire performance, not because of the play, but because your little boy had grown up while you were busy trying to build a better life for him. I looked at Dad. His lips trembled. I thought no one noticed. I noticed. The words escaped my mouth before I realized I had spoken them. He looked at me in surprise. I remember seeing someone standing by the back door. I couldn't see her face because of the lights. I always wondered who it was. A tear rolled down his cheek. It was me. For 20 years, we had both remembered the same evening, from completely different perspectives. Mom had quietly connected those memories with a single letter. She truly knew us better than we knew ourselves. I reached the final page. The handwriting became slightly shakier, as if she had written it during the final months of her illness. Promise me one thing. When I'm gone, don't spend your lives mourning the years you lost. Spend them creating the memories you still have time to make. Go fishing. Sit on the porch. Watch old movies. Laugh too loudly. Take photographs. Write letters. Say I love you before leaving the house. Because one day, one of you will walk through a room for the last time, and the people left behind won't remember how much money you earned or how many hours you worked. They'll remember whether they felt loved. That's the only inheritance that truly lasts. I love you both. Forever, Mom. By the time I reached the final word, the attic was silent, not because there was nothing left to say, but because every word that truly mattered had already been spoken. Dad reached over and hugged me. Not the quick embrace we shared at holidays. Not the awkward pat on the back between two grown men. This was the hug of a father who had waited more than 20 years to know his son understood him, and the hug of a son who had finally realized his father had loved him every single day. Outside, the clouds slowly drifted apart. Warm afternoon sunlight filled the attic. The blue box was empty now, but somehow, our hearts felt fuller than they ever had before. Yet one final chapter still remained. Because before we closed the attic for the last time, Dad quietly said something that changed everything. I have one more letter. I looked at him in surprise. I wrote it 20 years ago. I just never had the courage to give it to you. He reached into his jacket pocket and carefully unfolded a yellowed envelope with my name written across the front. To Ethan, the letter I had been waiting for. Without even knowing it existed, Dad held the yellowed envelope in both hands. For several seconds, he simply stared at my name. To Ethan, the handwriting was unmistakably his. Neat, careful, almost hesitant. He smiled sadly. I've carried this with me for over 20 years. You carried it? He nodded. In different wallets, different jackets, different houses, but I never found the courage to give it to you. I gently took the envelope. The paper was soft around the edges, worn from being unfolded and refolded countless times. On the back, there was a date, 24 December 2003, Christmas Eve. I looked at Dad. What happened that day? He looked down at his hands. I thought I was losing you. Those words caught me completely off guard. Losing me? You were 14. You had started spending more time with your friends. You barely spoke during dinner. You answered every question with one word. I laughed quietly through my tears. I was a teenager. He smiled. I know that now. But back then, I thought you hated me. The confession broke my heart. For years, I had believed I was the only one who felt distant. I never imagined my father had been afraid too. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The first line immediately blurred my vision. Dear Ethan, you'll probably never read this. I'm writing it because tonight I realized something. I know how to fix engines. I know how to build fences. I know how to work until my hands bleed. But I don't know how to talk to my own son anymore, and that scares me more than anything else. I swallowed hard. Dad quietly wiped away another tear. I continued reading. Every time I knock on your bedroom door, I worry you'll tell me to go away. Every time you say you're too busy. I wonder if it's because of the years I wasn't there. If that's true, I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry people say because they have to. The kind that keeps a man awake at 3 in the morning. I know I can't give you your childhood back. I know I can't erase the birthdays I missed, or the games I arrived too late to watch. But if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life making new memories with you, even if they're small ones, even if it's just eating breakfast together, or sitting quietly on the porch. I'd be grateful for every minute, because being your father has always been the greatest privilege of my life. My voice cracked. I could barely continue. The attic was silent, except for the sound of our breathing. I looked up. Dad wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the floor. Ashamed. I couldn't give it to you, he whispered. I thought it would make me look weak. I shook my head immediately. No, it makes you look human. For the first time that afternoon, Dad smiled. A real smile. Small, but genuine. I returned to the letter. One day you'll become a man. Maybe you'll even become a father. If that happens, you'll make mistakes. Probably more than you expect. Please remember this. Children don't need perfect parents. They need parents who keep coming back after they make mistakes. Promise me something. If we ever stop talking, don't wait 20 years to fix it. Life is shorter than we think. Love, Dad. I lowered the letter. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to explain. Nothing left to defend. Only years of love that had finally found the words they were missing. After several minutes, Dad stood and walked toward the attic window. The sun was beginning to set. Golden light spilled across the old wooden floor. He smiled quietly. You know, your grandfather used to tell me something. I looked over. He said, the strongest families aren't the ones that never break. They're the ones that choose to rebuild. I nodded slowly. Grandpa had been right. Families aren't held together by perfect memories. They're held together by forgiveness. Just as we were about to leave the attic, I noticed something tucked beneath the blue box. A small cassette recorder. Dust covered every corner. Dad frowned. I've never seen that before. Attached to it was a tiny note in my mother's handwriting. It read, "Play this together when you're both finally ready to smile again." I picked up the recorder carefully. If Mom had left us one final message, I knew it wouldn't be about the past. It would be about the future. And somehow, I had a feeling her voice would give our family exactly what we needed most before we closed this chapter forever. Neither of us moved. The old cassette recorder rested in my hands. Dust covered every corner. A faded piece of tape held a handwritten label. Family. Dad stared at it for a long time. I've never seen this before. Neither had I. I pressed the eject button. Inside was a small cassette tape. The date written across it made my heart stop. Mai 16, 2004. Just a few months after I'd written my final letter. I looked at Dad. Do we play it? He hesitated, then nodded. I think your mother wanted us to. We carried the recorder downstairs into the living room. The attic suddenly felt too small for what was about to happen. I placed the recorder on the coffee table, the same table where our family had eaten countless dinners, the same room where Mom had read books beside the fireplace. Everything felt familiar, yet somehow, everything felt new. I pressed play. For a few seconds, only static filled the room. Then, my mother's voice. Soft, gentle, exactly as I remembered it. Well, if you're listening to this, I guess I was right. Dad smiled through his tears. She always was. Mom laughed on the recording. I know the two of you. You're probably crying already. Despite everything, we both laughed. She knew us perfectly. Her voice continued. I didn't make this recording because I thought I was going to die. I made it because people forget to say important things while they still have time. The room fell silent again. I've spent years watching the two people I love most, trying so hard to protect each other, that neither of you noticed how much you were hurting yourselves. Dad lowered his head. Mom continued. David, you believed being a good father meant never letting your family struggle. But a child doesn't remember how much money was in the bank. They remember who sat beside them when they were afraid. Dad quietly whispered, I'm sorry, almost as if she could still hear him. Then she spoke my name. Ethan, if you're a grown man when you hear this, I hope you've learned something. Parents are just children who suddenly become responsible for another life. We don't receive a handbook. We guess, we fail, we learn, and every mistake hurts us far more than you'll ever know. I closed my eyes. For years, I had imagined my parents always knew the right thing to do. Now I understood. They had simply loved me enough to keep trying. The tape continued. I want to tell you both a story. It happened 6 months after Ethan was born. I woke up in the middle of the night. David wasn't in bed. I found him sitting on the kitchen floor. He was holding our last $20. He thought I was asleep. He kept whispering, "Please let me be enough for them." I looked at Dad. His face was buried in his hands. "I remember that night," he whispered. I was terrified. Mom's voice remained calm. I walked into the kitchen, sat beside him, and told him something. "You don't have to be enough by yourself. That's why families exist." A tear rolled down my cheek. Those simple words carried more wisdom than any speech I had ever heard. The recording grew quieter, as though Mom had moved closer to the microphone. "If you're hearing this together, then promise me something. Stop counting the birthdays you missed. Stop counting the mistakes. Start counting the mornings you still get to share, the dinners you still get to eat together, the phone calls you can still make, the hugs you can still give. Because one day, the ordinary moments you're ignoring today will become the memories you miss the most." The tape clicked softly. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then I heard something unexpected. A child's laughter. Mine. I couldn't have been older than 5. "Daddy, catch me." The recording filled with footsteps. Dad laughing. Mom laughing. My own tiny voice shouting with excitement. For nearly 2 minutes, there were no speeches, no life lessons. Just our family, playing in the backyard, happy, carefree, alive. Dad smiled through tears. I forgot we ever recorded that. I shook my head. "No, you didn't forget. You just needed someone to remind you." The tape reached its end. One final click echoed through the room. Silence returned, but it felt different now. Not empty, peaceful. Dad looked at the recorder for a long time, then quietly said, "Your mother always believed memories should be shared." I smiled. "Let's make some new ones." He looked at me, for the first time in years. There wasn't sadness in his eyes. There was hope. The blue box was empty. The letters had all been read. The recording had finally been heard. There was only one chapter left. Not about the past, not about regret, but about the promise we would make to each other before leaving that house behind forever. The house felt different that evening, not because anything had changed, but because we had. For the first time in more than 20 years, there were no unspoken words left between us. Dad quietly carried the blue box downstairs. He placed it on the dining table, the same table where our family had shared thousands of meals. He ran his hand across its worn wooden surface. "You know, your mother refused to replace this table." I smiled. I remember asking her why. Dad laughed softly. "She always gave the same answer. A family shouldn't throw away something just because it has a few scratches." We both looked at each other. Suddenly, we understood she had never been talking about the table. She had been talking about us. That night, neither of us wanted to leave. Instead of ordering takeout, Dad walked into the kitchen. "Help me?" I looked surprised. "Cook?" He laughed. "Your mother's spaghetti. We'll probably ruin it." I smiled for the first time all day. "Then let's ruin it together." For the next hour, we burned the garlic, dropped noodles on the floor, argued over how much salt belonged in the sauce, and laughed harder than we had in years. For a moment, it felt as though Mom was standing in the doorway, shaking her head and smiling at the two of us. When dinner was finally ready, it wasn't perfect, not even close, but neither of us cared, because for the first time in a very long time, we weren't just eating together, we were healing. After dinner, Dad disappeared into the garage. A few minutes later, he returned carrying an old tackle box. I recognized it immediately, Grandpa's fishing gear. He opened the rusty lid. Inside were faded lures, old hooks, a weathered compass, and 2 fishing licenses. One belonged to Grandpa. The other had my name on it, issued 22 years earlier, unused. Dad smiled sadly. You remember the fishing trip we kept postponing? I nodded. There was always something. Work, school, life. He closed the tackle box. No more excuses. The next morning, before sunrise, we drove to the same lake I had drawn in that first Father's Day letter. The lake where I imagined we would fish together. Only this time, we were really there. The water was perfectly still. Mist floated gently across the surface. Birds called from the trees. Neither of us rushed to speak. Sometimes, silence shared with someone you love says more than words ever could. Dad handed me Grandpa's old fishing rod. I think he'd want you to have this. I took it carefully. The handle was smooth from decades of use. It felt as though I was holding more than a fishing rod. I was holding a piece of my family's history. We cast our lines into the water. Minutes passed. Then Dad smiled. You know, I finally get to say something I've wanted to tell you for years. I looked over. He took a deep breath. I'm proud of you, Ethan. Not because of your job. Not because of your achievements. Not because you came back here. I'm proud of the man you've become. The words hit me harder than I expected. 20 years earlier, a little boy had written a letter wishing to hear exactly those words. Now, the little boy inside me finally did. I couldn't stop the tears. Neither could he. I laughed quietly. You know, I've been waiting a long time to hear that. Dad smiled. I know. I'm sorry it took so long. I shook my head. You still said it. And that's what matters. Hours later, as the sun climbed higher, something tugged hard on my fishing line. Dad laughed. Looks like your grandfather finally sent us some luck. Together, we pulled in the largest fish either of us had ever caught. Neither of us cared about its size. We cared that we had caught it together, just like the picture I had drawn as an 8-year-old boy. Best day ever. This time, it wasn't just a drawing. It was real. Months passed. Every Sunday became family day. No phones, no work, no excuse. Sometimes we went fishing. Sometimes we watched old home videos. Sometimes we simply sat on the porch drinking coffee and talking about Mom. We even started writing letters again, not because we were afraid to speak, but because we had learned something precious. Words written from the heart can last a lifetime. The blue box no longer held forgotten letters. Instead, it held new ones. Birthday letters, thank you notes, Christmas memories, stories for future grandchildren. A tradition had quietly begun. 1 year later, on the anniversary of Mom's passing, Dad and I returned to the attic. We placed the blue box back on the same shelf where I had found it. Inside, I tucked one final envelope. Across the front, I wrote, "For the next generation." Dad looked at me and smiled. "What did you write?" I smiled back. "They'll find out when the time is right. Because every family leaves something behind. Some leave houses. Some leave money. Some leave old photographs. Our family left something far more valuable. The courage to tell the truth. The strength to forgive. And the reminder that love isn't measured by how perfect we are, but by how faithfully we choose each other, day after day." As we turned off the attic light for the last time, I looked back at the little blue box. 20 years ago, it had been filled with silence. Today, it was filled with hope. And I finally understood the greatest lesson my parents had ever taught me. The strongest families are not the ones who never make mistakes. They are the ones who never stop finding their way back to each other.